The year is 1946. The place is a comfortable, converted country house in England, now serving as a high-security detention center for the highest-ranking officers of the fallen Third Reich. The British military historian B.H. Little Hart sits across from a man who once commanded armies of millions. The atmosphere is not one of hostility, but of professional curiosity. Little Hart poses a question that has haunted Allied command since the final shots were fired. He asks simply, "What was the most effective weapon we used against you?" He expects to hear about the atomic bomb, or the overwhelming industrial might of Detroit, or perhaps the relentless bombing campaigns that turned German cities into ash. He expects a technical answer about logistics or air superiority. Instead, the German commander leans forward. He does not talk about a weapon the Allies used, talks about a weapon the Allies put down. He speaks of a specific moment in September 1944, a window of time, barely 3 weeks long, when the German border stood wide open, undefended, and waiting for the end. He describes it as a miracle, not a miracle from God, but a strategic gift handed to them by the Supreme Allied Command. This German general, along with dozens of his peers, would later confirm a devastating truth that history books often gloss over in favor of celebration. They believed the war in Europe could have ended in 1944. They believed the death camps could have been liberated 6 months earlier. They believed that tens of thousands of American and British soldiers who died in the freezing mud of the Bulge and the Hürtgen Forest should have gone home alive. But they didn't, because just as the German throat was bared and the knife was raised, the Allies stopped. This is not the story of how the Allies won the war. This is the story of why they didn't win it sooner. To understand the magnitude of this mistake, we have to go back to the late summer of 1944. If you were an American GI in August of that year, you didn't just think the war was ending, you knew it. The breakout from Normandy hadn't just been a success. It had been a stampede. The German army in the West wasn't retreating, it was evaporating. General George S. Patton's Third Army was tearing across France at a speed that defied the logic of modern warfare. His tanks were moving so fast they were practically driving off the edges of their own tactical maps. Intelligence officers stopped reporting enemy positions because by the time the reports were typed, the enemy was already gone, surrendered, or dead. The Falaise pocket had gutted the Wehrmacht. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were captured. Their equipment irreplaceable Tiger tanks, artillery pieces, thousands of trucks lay burning on the French roads, creating a corridor of destruction so intense that pilots claimed they could smell the rotting flesh from 1,000 feet in the air. For the average American soldier, the mood was electric. There was a sensation known as victory disease. It was the intoxicating feeling that the hard part was over. The road to Berlin seemed to be paved not with mines, but with flowers thrown by liberated French villagers. There was a genuine, widespread belief that the boys would be home for Thanksgiving. And they weren't wrong to think so, because on the other side of the line, the Germans agreed with them. Field Marshal Walter Model was known as Hitler's fireman. Whenever a front was collapsing, Hitler sent Model to save it. But when Model arrived in the West in late August 1944, he didn't find a fire. He found a pile of ashes. Model was a realist. He looked at his maps and saw a catastrophe. The Siegfried Line, the legendary West Wall that was supposed to protect the German border, was a ghost town. The concrete bunkers were there, but there were no guns in them. The trenches were dug, but they were filled with rainwater, not soldiers. In early September, Model sent a report to Berlin that was terrifying in its honesty. He had barely 100 operational tanks left to defend the entire western frontier. Against him stood an Allied force of over 2 million men and thousands of Sherman tanks. Between Patton's tanks and the Rhine River, there was nothing. No reserves, no secret weapons, no organized defense. The industrial heart of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, which produced the steel and coal, keeping the Reich alive, was wide open. If the Allies punched through now, the war economy would collapse in days. Model prepared for the end. He knew that if the Americans kept driving, kept pushing with the singular, ruthless aggression they had shown for the last month, he would be signing a surrender document before the leaves turned brown. But then, something strange happened. The roar of the American engines began to fade. The relentless pressure on the German lines suddenly eased. Model waited for the hammer blow. He waited for the concentrated thrust that would shatter his fragile line. Day after day he looked through his binoculars, expecting to see the dust clouds of thousands of tanks on the horizon. But the horizon remained empty. The Allies had stopped. The decision that saved the German army was not made on the battlefield. It was made in a conference room. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was a man carrying the weight of the world. He was a brilliant administrator and a political genius, but he was now facing a dilemma that would define his legacy. He had a supply problem. The Allied advance had been so fast that they had outrun their logistics. The fuel was still coming from the beaches of Normandy, hundreds of miles away, carried by the truck drivers of the Red Ball Express. Every gallon of gasoline was liquid gold. There simply wasn't enough fuel to supply every army for a full-speed advance into Germany. Eisenhower had two choices. Choice A was the single thrust. This was the gambler's option. It meant taking every drop of gas, every truck, and every bullet, and giving it to one commander, likely Patton or Bradley. It meant telling the rest of the army to sit still while a single massive spearhead punched through the German lines, crossed the Rhine, and drove straight for Berlin. It was higher risk. If the spearhead was cut off, it could be a disaster. It worked. The war ends in weeks. Choice B was the broad front. This was the safe option. It meant spreading the supplies equally. It meant all armies, British, American, Canadian, would advance slowly and steadily, shoulder to shoulder, pushing the Germans back along the entire length of the border. It was low risk. It ensured no one got flanked. But it was slow. Agonizingly slow. Militarily, the situation screamed for the single thrust. The German army was broken. You do not give a broken enemy time to breathe. You do not pause to align your lines when the opponent is lying on the ropes. You knock them out. But Eisenhower wasn't just a general. He was the chairman of a board. He was managing a volatile coalition. On his left flank, he had Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British hero. Montgomery was demanding priority. He wanted the fuel. He wanted to lead the thrust in the north. On his right flank, he had George Patton. Patton was the American favorite, the master of speed, who was begging for the gas, claiming he could be in Berlin in 30 days if Eisenhower just unleashed him. If Eisenhower gave the fuel to Patton, the British public would be outraged. If he gave it to Montgomery, the American press would revolt. The political unity of the alliance was fragile. Churchill was watching. Roosevelt was watching. Eisenhower chose the broad front. He chose the compromise. He decided to keep everyone happy, keep everyone moving a little bit, rather than letting one man win the war alone. It was a decision made for political harmony. It was a decision that prioritized the safety of the alliance over the speed of the victory. And it was exactly the mistake the Germans were praying for. The order went down the line. Patton was furious. His Third Army, the most lethal fighting force on the continent, ground to a halt. Not because of German fire, but because their fuel tanks were dry. One of Patton's Corps' commanders, General Walton Walker, actually wept when he received the order to stop. He was standing on a hill looking at the German border. There were no enemy troops ahead of him. He could have walked across, but his tanks were silent, while the Americans sat and waited for supplies that were being diverted to other sectors. The miracle of the West began to happen on the German side. This is where the tragedy truly deepens. It wasn't just that the Allies stopped. It was what they allowed the Germans to do with that time. Walter Model did not waste a single second of the gift Eisenhower had given him. He scoured the rear areas of Germany. He pulled men out of factories. He grabbed teenagers from the Hitler Youth. He found old men who were veterans of the First World War. He emptied hospitals of the walking wounded. He gave them rifles, Panzerfausts, and shovels. And he sent them to the Siegfried Line. For 3 weeks, while the Allied generals argued over maps and fuel allocations, the Germans dug. They reactivated the bunkers. They laid minefields. They registered artillery coordinates. The ghost army that model had on paper in August became a real army of flesh and blood by October. When the Allies finally resumed their major offensive, the window was closed. The undefended border was gone. In its place was a wall of steel and fanaticism. The cost of the broad front strategy was not paid in currency. It was paid in blood in places like the Hürtgen Forest. Because the rapid thrust had been canceled, The Allies were forced into a grinding, attrition-based warfare. They had to clear the ground mile by mile. The Hürtgen Forest is perhaps the darkest example of this failure. It was a dense, dark, medieval-looking woodland that had little strategic value. But because the broad front doctrine dictated that no ground be skipped, American commanders sent division after division into the meat grinder. The Germans, now dug in and reorganized, turned the forest into a slaughterhouse. Artillery shells burst in the treetops, raining shrapnel down on GIs who had no cover. It was a factory of death. Over 33,000 American soldiers became casualties in the Hürtgen Forest. Historians today look at the battle and ask, why? Why fight there? If Patton had been allowed to break through in September, the Hürtgen Forest would have been bypassed entirely. Those 33,000 men were casualties of a timeline that shouldn't have existed. They died fighting an enemy who should have already surrendered. Eisenhower's compromise also led to one of the most famous disasters of the war, Operation Market Garden. In an attempt to appease Montgomery and end the war with a narrow front thrust after all but in the wrong play, Eisenhower authorized a massive airborne invasion of Holland. It was Montgomery's plan. It was supposed to be the bold stroke that made up for the September delay. But it was too late. The Germans had recovered. The paratroopers dropped not into a vacuum, but onto SS Panzer divisions that had been refitting in the area divisions that would have been destroyed or captured if the pressure had been maintained weeks earlier. Market Garden was a failure. The bridge at Arnhem proved to be a bridge too far. The Allies lost thousands of elite troops. The war did not end by Christmas. The stalemate set in. There is a psychological element to this story that is rarely discussed in standard documentaries. We talk about logistics and maps, but we forget the mind of the soldier. In September 1944, the average German soldier was defeated. Psychologically, he was done. He had seen his comrades surrender in droves. He knew the war was lost. There is a momentum to defeat a psychological breaking point where an army simply quits fighting because they believe fighting is useless. The Wehrmacht had reached that point. But when the Allies stopped, that momentum broke. Imagine the German soldier in a bunker on the Siegfried Line. He is waiting for the Americans. He is terrified. He writes a final letter to his wife. He clutches his rifle, shaking. The Americans don't come. 1 day passes, then 2, then a week. He starts to look around. He sees a tank arrive to support him. Then he sees an officer who brings ammunition. He sees that he is not alone. The fear turns into confusion, and then, crucially, it turns into hope. And then hope turns into resolve. The narrative changes from "we are lost" to "we held them off." The broad front strategy didn't just give the Germans time to build bunkers. It gave them time to rebuild their belief. It allowed the Nazi propaganda machine to spin a narrative of the miracle on the West Wall. It convinced hundreds of thousands of German soldiers that the war was still winnable, or at least that they could defend their homeland. This psychological shift was deadly. A soldier who thinks he is already dead surrenders. A soldier who thinks he has a fighting chance fights to the death. The Allies, by pausing, transformed a beaten mob back into a lethal fighting force. The ultimate price of the delay came in December 1944. Adolf Hitler, realizing that his enemies were moving slowly and cautiously, saw one last opportunity. He gathered the reserves that Model had rebuilt. He took the tanks that had come off the assembly lines during the quiet months of autumn, and he launched the Battle of the Bulge. It was the largest battle the American army ever fought. 19,000 Americans were killed. 80,000 were wounded or captured. It was a desperate, terrifying surprise attack that shattered the quiet winter front, and it was entirely preventable. If the war had ended in September, if Patton had crossed the Rhine when the gates were open, the Battle of the Bulge would never have happened. Those panzer divisions would have been destroyed in their assembly areas. The fuel they used would have been captured. The men who fought in it would have been in POW camps. Every freezing night of the Battle of the Bulge, every scream of a wounded soldier in the snow, was a direct echo of the silence in September. We return to the interrogation room. Little Hart finishes his notes. He looks at the transcript. The consensus among the German generals was unanimous. Von Rundstedt, Blumentritt, Manteufelmann, who hated each other, men who disagreed on almost everything, all agreed on this. They called the broad front strategy the great mistake. They could not understand why the Allies, possessing absolute air superiority and overwhelming mobility, chose to fight a slow linear war. One German general, Hasso von Manteuffel, put it chillingly: "You fought us like a rich man. You used your wealth of supplies to push us back everywhere at once, instead of using your brain to stab us in the heart." They respected Patton. They feared him. They studied his movements with obsession. When Patton stopped, they toasted their good fortune with champagne. It is easy to criticize generals from the safety of the future. Eisenhower was a great man, held the alliance together. He defeated the Nazis. He is rightfully a hero. But history requires us to be honest about the cost of victory. The 6-month delay between September 1944 and May 1945 was not just more time, it was the deadliest phase of the war. During those extra 6 months, the Holocaust continued. The gas chambers at Auschwitz operated at maximum capacity through the autumn and winter of 1944. Anne Frank died in Bergen-Belsen in early 1945, months after the window of opportunity had closed. During those 6 months, the V-2 rockets rained down on London. During those 6 months, the Soviet Union advanced deep into Eastern Europe, redrawing the map of the Cold War and subjecting half the continent to decades of Soviet rule. A faster Allied victory might have seen the Iron Curtain drawn much further east, the decision to play it safe. To choose the broad front changed the geopolitical structure of the 20th century. In military academies today, the broad front versus single thrust debate is still taught. It is the classic struggle between the political needs of a coalition and the ruthless efficiency of war. Eisenhower did what a politician had to do. He kept the family together, but Patton knew what a warrior had to do. He wanted to kill the enemy. The tragedy of 1944 is that they were both right in their own way, but the soldiers on the ground paid the difference. The next time you hear about the inevitability of Allied victory, remember the German generals in that interrogation room. Remember their shock, their relief, and their disbelief. They were ready to surrender, were checking their watches, waiting for the end. But the clock kept ticking. And because it kept ticking, thousands of men who should have been fathers and grandfathers became names on white marble crosses instead. The war ended in May 1945, but for the ghosts of the Hürtgen Forest, and for the families of the boys who died in the Bulge, the real question will always be, why didn't it end in September?